Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 1917 to 1921. In the final years of the First World War, the Russian Empire was coming to its end. It had been devastated by revolution and finally transformed into the first communist country in the world. In the years following the revolution, non-Russian nations that lived under the House of Romanov sought to secure their long-lost independence. One of these was Ukraine. From 1917 until 1921, the Ukrainians struggled to build and secure an independent country, fighting against the new regime, against their neighbors in the West, and amongst themselves. When in February 1917, the revolution had overthrown the monarchy in Russia, and the event had echoed throughout the entire empire. In Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the Central Rada, or the Central Council, had taken over control of the country, which on June 23, 1917, proclaimed the free Ukrainian National Republic without severing its connections with the Russian state. The nation began to awake. However, keeping the vast territory of Ukraine under control was a difficult task, and the country rapidly slid into anarchy. The collapse of the Russian forces in Galicia made matters even worse. On November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, staged an armed insurrection in Petrograd, today known as St. Petersburg, and this became the uprising that changed the country for good. 3 days after this, together with the aid from Rada, the Bolsheviks attacked the army staff headquarters in Kyiv, forcing them to leave the city. However, contrary to Lenin's plans, control over Ukraine was quickly taken over by the Central Rada. The Bolsheviks were not popular in Ukraine, having no more than 5,000 party members in the country. Most of their supporters were industrial workers, Russians, and Jews from the Donetsk region. These men were antagonistic to the Ukrainian national movement. The Bolsheviks confronted Rada right from the start. On December 17, 1917, after failing to grab control over the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks left Kyiv for Kharkiv and proclaimed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Already at that point, the Bolshevik troops from Russia were preparing for the invasion of Ukraine. The war was about to start. The invasion army of 30,000 men entered Ukraine on December 25, 1917. Led by Vladimir Antonov-Ovseenko, it comprised regulars of the Army of Soviet Russia and local Red Guards from eastern Ukraine. In response to the invasion, Central Rada proclaimed an independent Ukrainian state. Ukraine was defended by Free Cossack units, workers' battalions, the Hidamaka Battalion, comprising military school students, and the Galician Bukovinian Battalion of Sich Riflemen, which was made up of former Austrian prisoners of war. The strength of the Rada's forces was not more than 15,000 men. Ukrainian forces proved inadequate in stopping the invasion. One after another, towns in eastern Ukraine were falling into the hands of the Bolshevik troops. By the end of January, they had occupied Donbas and left Bank Ukraine and were approaching the city of Kyiv itself. The Central Rada sent a unit of around 500 volunteers to meet the invasion force. The student battalion of Sich Riflemen and a detachment of the Hidamaka Battalion faced the enemy in the Battle of Kruty on January 29, 1918. Both sides had armored trains at the seam, but on different tracks. The Bolshevik troops quickly disembarked from their train carriages and started running towards the young Ukrainian soldiers, who jumped into a makeshift trench system and opened fire with their rifles and Maxim machine guns. The Bolshevik wave was driven back, but the inexperienced students thought that they were in a full-blown retreat, so they jumped out of their trenches and began to give chase. At this point, the next wave of Bolsheviks charged out from their train, and vicious hand-to-hand fighting ensued. Plus, the artillery fire from both trains added to the carnage. The students were hopelessly outnumbered, and the few that were left alive were taken prisoner. They were shown no mercy, though, as a firing squad was quickly formed up, and about 18 of the young men were executed on the spot. That same day, the Bolsheviks staged an armed rebellion in Kyiv to overthrow the Central Rada. The fighting in the city lasted until February 4th, when government forces defeated the last group of insurgents. The failure of the uprising in Kyiv didn't withhold the advance of the Bolshevik army. The Central Rada was forced to evacuate Kyiv on February 8th. A day later, the Bolshevik troops entered the city and instigated their reign of terror. Facing total defeat, the Central Rada resorted to requesting foreign assistance. On the same day that the Bolsheviks entered Kyiv, on February 9, 1918, the Ukrainian National Republic signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with the Central Powers. According to the articles of the treaty, Germany and Austro-Hungary had committed to providing military aid to the Ukrainians in fighting the Bolsheviks in return for them delivering large quantities of foodstuff. In late February 1918, 450,000 German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers marched into Ukraine and swept away the Bolshevik forces. On March 1, 1918, the Central Rada returned to Kyiv. By the end of April, troops of the Central Powers had regained control of the entire Ukraine. The defeat of the Bolshevik troops in Ukraine coerced Lenin to sign the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and recognize the independence of the Ukrainian National Republic. On June 12, 1918, the governments in Moscow and Kyiv signed a preliminary peace. The peace with Russia brought no stability to Ukraine, though. The Germans overthrew the Central Rada and installed a Hetman government to secure a better foodstuff supply. Until November 1918 and the capitulation of the Central Powers, the Germans were controlling Ukraine. On December 14, 1918, they left Kyiv, and a new government came into power, the Directory of the Ukrainian National Republic. On January 22, 1919, the Ukrainian National Republic proclaimed the union with the Western Ukrainian National Republic, the Ukrainian ethnic territory of the former Austria-Hungary. Formerly one country, the Ukrainian National Republic and the Western Ukrainian National Republic were actually two separate states with their own governments and armies. After the Germans withdrew, Ukraine fell into a state of complete anarchy. 6 different armies operated in the territory during 1919. The Army of the Ukrainian National Republic, the Ukrainian Galician Army, Soviet Russia's Red Army, a Russian anti-communist coalition, the White Army, Polish troops, the Entente troops, and the anarchist units. Taking advantage of the chaotic situation in the country, Moscow launched a new offensive against Ukraine in December 1918. Kyiv responded with a declaration of war on the Russian Soviet Republic. The Ukrainians were entirely unprepared for the war, though. Their army of 25,000 men consisted of 2 main units, the Sich Riflemen and the Zaporozhian Corps, along with a number of partisan units under the command of politically unreliable otamans. Against them was the Expeditionary Force, composed of Red Army regular units and local irregulars. They too had around 25,000 men under arms, but their strength rose progressively with many partisan units joining their side. Under the command of Vladimir Antonov-Ovseenko, the Red Army advanced on 3 fronts to eliminate the enemy and prevent the army of the Ukrainian National Republic forming up with the Galician Army and the Entente troops that had landed at Odessa while World War I was still in progress. The Red Army was victorious in the first months of the campaign, entering the city of Kyiv on February 5, 1919. After the loss of the capital, the head of the Directory was replaced with Simon Petliura, an experienced and prominent leader of the Ukrainian national movement. Under his leadership, the army of the UNR launched a counteroffensive in March 1919, pushing the Red Army units back almost to Kyiv. During the spring and summer of 1919, the Ukrainians and Russians fought vigorously in eastern Ukraine, while the Galician Army was fighting the invading Polish army in the west. 2 allied armies, the Army of the UNR and the Galician Army, joined forces in 1919, forming a combined Ukrainian force of nearly 85,000 regulars and 15,000 partisans. This mighty force was able to deal with the Red Army units and even entered Kyiv on August 31st. In the country's capital, the joint Ukrainian army confronted the Volunteer Army of the Whites, which led to the UNR declaring war on them. The autumn of 1919 was not good for the Ukrainians, though, as the situation was aggravated by an outbreak of typhus, which by October 1919 had decimated both the army of the UNR and the Galician army. The 2 allied armies began to split on the question of their relationship with the White Movement. The Galicians signed a separate peace treaty with them on November 6, 1919, leaving the army of the UNR to fight against the Red Army, the Poles, and the White Movement by themselves. In the given circumstances, starting from December 4, 1919, the army of the UNR decided to abandon their regular military operations and switch to irregular warfare instead. During the first winter campaign from December 6, 1919 to May 6, 1920, the Ukrainian Irregulars fought the Soviet 14th Army units over the entire territory of Ukraine. The Irregulars marched for more than 2,500 kilometers during the campaign and fought in more than 50 battles. On April 22, 1920, the UNR government signed a Warsaw Treaty with the Poles, recognizing their claim to areas of western Ukraine in return for military assistance in the war against Soviet Russia. On April 25th, the Polish army, assisted by soldiers of the UNR army, launched an offensive on Kyiv. The city was liberated on May 7th, but only for a short time. The Red Army counteroffensive pushed the Poles and Ukrainians all the way back to Warsaw. In the ensuing months, the destiny of Ukraine depended on the outcome of the Polish-Soviet War. Finally, exhausted by the costs of war, the two sides signed the Peace of Riga Treaty on March 18, 1921. A border between the two countries was established, with western Ukraine going to Poland. The eastern part of the country became the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. The remnants of the UNR army continued to fight the Soviets. Their plan to launch an all-out attack against Soviet troops in Ukraine were interrupted by the Red Army offensive on November 10th. After 11 days of bitter fighting, the Ukrainians were pushed back into Polish-controlled Galicia. Over there, soldiers of the UNR army were disarmed and put into internment camps. The second winter campaign in November 1921 was the last attempt for the Ukrainians to continue their fight against the Soviets. 3 groups of volunteers from the interned soldiers were organized to enter Ukraine to inflict irregular warfare against the Soviets. They were poorly armed and equipped, but eager to fight, and morale was high. Their effort was futile, though. In the Battle of Milivojevic, the Soviets crushed the last of the Ukrainian forces when the Bolshevik cavalry intercepted them, and 443 Ukrainian soldiers were captured, of which 359 of them were executed. The second winter campaign was the last military operation conducted by the Ukrainian National Republic in their war against the Soviets that had lasted for more than 4 years. The Soviets ultimately won the war and formed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. On December 28, 1922, the Republic became one of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.